Hi girls, so as promised, here is the video annotating the next war. So the next war is, as you know from the notes I displayed last lesson, one of Wilfred Owen's more bitter, resentful, but also more accessible poems. So this was something that he wrote after having known Siegfried Sassoon, who advised him that he should make his poetry more colloquial and more accessible for young people so that he could be prophetic and warn them against war. So he's clearly taken that into account when writing this poem, and that's evidenced by the fact that it does start with a quote from Siegfried Sassoon. He says, "War's a joke for me and you, while we know such dreams are true." So this is actually a quote from one of Sassoon's more optimistic poems, and the next war, while it is bitter and resentful, can also be interpreted as being optimistic in terms of the way he represents the soldiers and their strength and their courage. So although Wilfred Owen is very critical of authorities and of war as a principle, he actually is very supportive and admires the courage and the bravery of the soldiers who went through so much as he did. So although he objects to war and criticizes it, he never criticizes the soldiers. They're simply victims and survivors. So yeah, Siegfried Sassoon's poem that this is taken from is again optimistic in terms of its treatment of the soldiers. So although they die at war, the soldiers, according to Sassoon, continue to live on in nature. And as you can see, he is, similarly to Owen, very critical of war, with the metaphor here characterising war as a joke. The next war is written in a very traditional sonnet form, which you know means that it has the octave for the first stanza with 8 lines and the sestet for the second stanza with 6 lines. But as well as the actual structure of the stanzas, this is also a traditional sonnet in terms of the rhyme scheme. So typically a sonnet has a very structured rhyme scheme, and this one does follow it. So we have the octave with the rhyme scheme A, B, B, A, C, D, D, C, which is typical of the Italian sonnet form. So there are 2 types of sonnet, the Italian and the English. So this one follows the rhyme scheme of the English sonnet. However, the sestet follows the rhyme scheme of the octave follows the rhyme scheme of the Italian sonnet, but the sestet follows the rhyme scheme of the English sonnet. So that's E, F, E, F, and then a rhyming couplet at the end. So you can see that although he is following the traditional form and structure, he still is playing around with it a little bit. And this ties in with the fact that although he is using traditional forms, he's doing so in a very critical way. So similar to Strange Meeting, where Wilfred Owen is very explicitly criticising romantic writing and the way that it depicted war, here he's using the sonnet form, which was typically used for love poems, and he's using it to cover content and ideas which very much conflicted with what poets in the Romantic era were writing about. So the fact that he's playing around and merging these 2 traditional sonnet forms definitely reflects the fact that he is being very critical of the traditional ideas and style of the sonnet. So just make a note that that is an unusual rhyme scheme. So he's mixed English and Italian. Okay, so looking at the start of the poem, what's significant is that from the outset, he's establishing the setting of his poem as somewhere far from home, out there. Okay, so the setting equals far from home. Okay, so immediately He's making his reader feel uncomfortable out there. We're not in the usual comfortable area. We're actually somewhere different, somewhere unusual, somewhere alien. Okay, so he's already establishing the battlefield as somewhere abnormal. Then we have, we've walked quite friendly up to death. Now, throughout this poem, he uses the collective pronoun we to create a sense of inclusion. So he's talking about himself and the soldiers. With the collective pronoun, we have this idea of a unified force of the soldiers working together. So note that that's a collective pronoun, creating inclusive language. Okay, and we have the personification of death, but also the oxymoron. So friendly up to death, oxymoron, because typically death is not associated with anything friendly. Okay, but the capitalization of death is something significant here as well. Not only do we have death being capitalized, but also later in the poem, he refers to his powers and uses a capital H for that. So the capitalization of death sets it up almost as a holy power. So death is not just this abstract idea, it's on the same level as God. So it is this holy kind of identity. Okay, sat down and eaten with him. So we have the personification of death. Oh, that's not going to fit. Of death throughout. Sat down and eaten with him, cool and bland, pardoned his spilling mess tins in our hand. So again, we have this rhyme scheme you can already see is giving the poem a nice flow, making it sound kind of lyrical. It's easy to read, but this conflicts with the actual content, the ideas that he's expressing through it. We've sniffed the green thick odour of his breath. Now, this line here, the thick green odour of his breath, is significant because one, it establishes a sense of closeness. Okay, being able to sniff someone's breath, obviously you're very, very close to them. However, the thick green odour of his breath is an allusion to gas, which is a very typical weapon that Wilfred Owen wrote about in World War I. However, it's also a reference to Dulce et decorum est. And so when you're writing about, if you were to write about these two poems together, that would be a really nice connection that you can draw out. Okay, our eyes wept, but our courage didn't writhe. So we have the juxtaposition here between weeping and courage, and we have the alliteration of wept and writhe, although it's not actually a phonetic alliteration, so you can't hear the W in writhe, but the way that it appears on the page, you do get a sense of the alliteration. So what he's doing here is he's actually establishing a difference. He's creating a distinction between the soldiers' bodies and their spirits. Okay, so he's making a clear distinction between the physical reactions of the soldiers. So our eyes wept, but our courage didn't writhe, shows that they're grieving the loss of their fellow soldiers. So they encounter death, just as you can see that the soldier in Dulce et decorum est is shaken by the death of his friend. He is affected by it. So our eyes wept, but our courage didn't writhe. So in spite of being faced with death, and obviously being affected by it, the soldiers continue to be courageous, continue to fight on, in order to survive. Okay, and then when we go on to the next line, he spattered us with bullets and he's coughed shrapnel. Now, this is quite vivid visual imagery, and it's quite negative as well. Spitting, coughing shrapnel, these are violent, aggressive acts. So again, it's the continued personification, and here also some negative imagery. Okay, so it creates a sense of the violence of death on the battlefield. Another thing that's important to note is also the use of enjambment, which I can't remember if I've told you guys about. But enjambment is when, so if you look at the other lines in this poem, you can see that all the punctuation comes at the end of the line. So you have death and then you have the comma and the dash. Cool and bland, comma. So it's natural to take a breath after each line. So when you end a line with a full stop or with some kind of punctuation, it makes it natural that you take a breath at that point. However, Owen's use of enjambment means that the gap between the lines is actually quite jarring, especially when he hasn't done that throughout the rest of it. So we've sniffed the green thick odour of his breath. Our eyes wept, but our courage didn't writhe. He spattered us with bullets and he's coughed shrapnel. We chorused when he sang aloft. See how it's quite unusual here that there's no punctuation there. The sentence continues on to the next line. So that's what enjambment is. It's when the punctuation and the lines don't correspond. So the sentence continues into the next line, which has a jarring, uncomfortable effect for the audience. So again, this is another example of how he's using a very traditional form and poetic structure, but using it in a way that's just slightly off. So he lulls you into a false sense of security, where the rhyme scheme and the rhythm all seem to be quite smooth and going along quite consistently. And then he occasionally uses enjambment just to throw you off your feet, but also to create emphasis. So when you have a poet doing anything in a poem which differs from the rest of it, that's always for emphasis. So in the two occasions in this poem where Owen is using enjambment, that shows that he wants us to pay attention to those lines. He wants us to be thinking about what we're reading at that point. So enjambment creates emphasis. And a jarring effect. Okay, we chorused when he sang aloft. So this is a metaphor. And shows how both death and the soldiers have their individual roles in war. So it's a metaphor comparing the soldiers and death on the battlefield to members of a chorus, to a singing performance. So they chorus, so they sing in the background while he sings in the foreground, or in the spotlight. So we have the metaphor of the chorus there. And then we also have this kind of imagery here. We whistled while he shaved us with his scythe. Now, whistling while he shaved us is almost a reference to a barber shop. You get this image of men kind of relaxed, having this sense of camaraderie with their barber, who's shaving their faces, which was, kind of a like a rite of passage, kind of a traditional ritual that men would have. So we have this image here of the typical comfortable male ritual. So a typical comfortable ritual at home, and then I'll just put in brackets, barbershop. Okay, but then we have the reference to the scythe. Now, what this is an allusion to is the Grim Reaper. Okay, so that's an example of imagery used to characterize the the personified death as the Grim Reaper, which is definitely a negative image. And so this is where we start to have the difference between the octave and the sestet. So as you know, in the sonnet, between these two stanzas, you have a change in pace or in focus. So whereas previously he's describing the way that death is present on the battlefield, with this somewhat out of place reference to death as the Grim Reaper, we then move into our octave, into our sestet, sorry. One thing that I forgot to mention, sat down and eaten with him in our second line. Eating with somebody is symbolic of a very social, very friendly kind of relationship. Okay, so this is a symbol of friendship and trust. So the fact that you're sitting down and eating with death demonstrates a trusting, open relationship. Okay. Now let's have a look at our sestet. So here we have a slight change in pace, and the way that we see that is through the exclamation and the higher modality of that first line. So death was never enemy of ours. Okay, so we have the use of high modality and exclamation through both the exclamation mark but also O at the beginning. And now this line, the line where you first start to have the change in pace. So the first line of the sestet is referred to as the volta. That's the technical term for it. So if you were to refer to this line in your essay, you could say this is demonstrated in the volta of the next war. Oh, death was never enemy of ours. Okay, so that's referred to as the volta, which is simply the first line of the refocused sestet. So that's the line where the change occurs. So, oh, death was never enemy of ours. The exclamation and the high modality mark that as the volta. And so this is establishing that the soldiers are so familiar with death that here it's death was never an enemy. We were always comfortable with death. We were never afraid of him. We laughed at him. We leagued with him, old chum. So again, we had this use of very colloquial, familiar language. Okay, and the repetition. We laughed, we leagued, and then later in this stanza, we have we laughed again. Okay, so the repetition here is creating emphasis on the closeness of their relationship with death. So what Owen is suggesting in this poem is just how much death pervades the battlefield. So death is everywhere in war. No soldiers paid to kick against his powers. Now this is where we have the capitalization of his, which is typically something done when referring to God, okay, when referring to a religious figure. So the capitalization of his establishes death as a holy worshipped entity, okay? So for the soldiers on the battlefield, death is almost a religion, almost a god. So you could suggest that Wilfred Owen is here criticizing religion, saying that on the battlefield, religion is irrelevant. Okay, it's redundant. On the battlefield, the only religion that they have is the relationship between them and death. We laughed, knowing that better men would come and greater wars. When each proud fighter brags, he wars on death for lives, not men for flags. So, again, you can see here, when each proud fighter brags, he wars on death. Now, again, we have enjambment. Okay, so creating a disjointed sense, kind of putting the reader on their toes again, removing that sense of comfort from the traditional rhyme scheme that he's been using, which is now in the English form rather than the Italian, which was used in the octave. So brags he wars on death for lives, not men for flags. Now flags is a symbol of patriotism. Okay, the flags of their country. And what he's saying in this final line is that the soldiers do not war on other men. Their goal on the battlefield is not to fight other men for their countries. Rather, their goal on the battlefield is to fight death for their own lives, okay, and for the lives of their fellow soldiers. So when each proud fighter brags, he wars on death for lives, not men for flags. So fighting to survive. Not fighting to honour your country or to win success for your nation. Okay, so in this final line, Wilfred Owen is offering a criticism of patriotism, suggesting that battle is senseless, it's pointless, because the outcome of fighting for your country is meaningless, because what it comes down to on the battlefield is not to kill another man for your country, but rather to kill another man to avoid your own death. Okay, so as you can see from the next war, it's quite complex in terms of structure and form. There's a lot you can say about the way that he's used structure in this poem, with the use of the sonnet structure and rhyme scheme, and also the use of enjambment allows you to make some quite sophisticated arguments about form and structure. So I would really strongly recommend this for the question that you have been given for your essay, because the whole notion of warning is really key to this. So his final stanza is almost a message from the current soldiers, okay, the current soldiers who are bragging, the current soldiers who are laughing. It's a warning from them to future soldiers. Better men would come and greater wars. So this direct allusion to the future makes it a really explicit warning that Wilfred Owen is offering to the young men of the future should they wish to engage in battle at war. Okay, so there's lots to say about this. I'm going to post up a table for an alarm matrix for the next war, so that if you do choose to use this for your essay, you can ensure that you're getting those 3 levels of analysis and some evaluation ready to use for your introduction and conclusion. But I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have any further questions about this poem.